This program is brought to you by Link TV for educational and non-commercial use only. Mosaic, a daily news program from Link TV, presents a selection of news reports from independent and state-controlled broadcasters from throughout the Middle East.
The subway system in New York, which is the financial capital of the United States, is a tempting target for terrorists. American officials have added extensive security measures to these subway trains that are used by more than 5 million people on a daily basis.
There are three things that terrorists look for when they decide on a target. The target must have significant economic value so that the attack would generate a lot of media attention. The target must also have a high concentration of Jews, such as Wall Street and the former World Trade Center.
I was always uneasy flying, even before September 11th. Nothing has changed for me. I feel safe. Perhaps I should not be feeling this way.
Security officials have acknowledged that the security situation is better now than it used to be before September 11, 2001. However, they emphasize that a lot of things still need to be done. Terrorism experts predict that some kind of a terrorist attack will happen in New York. This time, however, they argue that such an attack would leave a large psychological impact on the residents of the city. However, what worries them most are weapons of mass destruction if used in future terrorist operations. Such attacks would force most of New York's residents to migrate, and most importantly, would stop the business operation of Wall Street, America's financial heart.
أسلحة الدمار الشامل وفقا للخبراء تنقسم إلى 3 أنواع.
Experts divide weapons of mass destruction into 3 categories. The most dangerous are biological weapons because they are relatively easy to obtain. If biological weapons are used effectively, thousands of New York residents can be killed. Chemical weapons are less effective than biological weapons in causing destruction, but they are very effective when used against the financial targets in New York. Nuclear weapons are hard to acquire despite the fact that the size of such weapons can be relatively smaller today. Yes, there are intensive security measures and better coordination between the different intelligence agencies inside New York and outside it. But one security official told Al Arabiya television that 55 countries in the world have enriched uranium, and some of these countries are not friends of the United States. Like many security experts, he predicts that terrorist attacks will happen in New York in the next 5 years. However, he is praying that future terrorist attacks would not consist of weapons of mass destruction.
ولا يكون هذا الهجوم الإرهابي بسلاح دمار شامل. طلال الحاج، العربية، نيويورك.
Most Arab Americans living in New York State believe that they are now less afraid of a backlash in the aftermath of the September 11 attacks. However, they still need to do more to fight the discrimination, which many Arabs have been subjected to on a daily basis. The Al Jazeera correspondent visited an Arab American summer camp in New York State and talked to some Arabs who confirmed that they are more connected than ever to their Arab nationalism.
The September 11 attacks have not changed life here at this most popular park in New York City. Many local residents from different religious and ethnic backgrounds, including Muslims, Christians, and Jews, visit this park, especially during weekends. 5 years ago, and not too far from this park, nearly 3,000 people lost their lives on September 11, 2001. It was a very difficult time for Arab Americans who faced a lot of discrimination and backlash in the aftermath of these attacks. Many Arab Americans have put the painful memories of the September 11th attacks behind them. They are indeed looking forward to a brighter future despite the many difficulties of the road ahead.
Americans fear us. On the same token, there's a lot of fear by Arabs of the American public.
She was 12 years old on September 11th, and this is how she looks now.
Prior to the September 11th attacks, I remember that I was going to wear the hijab or headscarf. However, after the attacks, my mother told me not to wear the hijab because I would be targeted.
We do have a lot of skilled Arab professionals in the United States. However, many of them are facing job discrimination.
Many Arab Americans believe that they must use their culture and heritage to diffuse common fear that is mounting among both Americans and Arabs. They need a new generation of Americans and Arabs who are capable of forgetting the past. Arab Americans have different experiences and stories regarding the September 11th, 2001 attacks. A group of ambitious Arab American women have established social organizations that teach young women Arabic art and culture.
Certainly, our condition has improved since the September 11th attacks, but the situation has not returned to normal.
Despite the negative image of Arabs in the aftermath of the September 11 attacks, this young Egyptian woman is trying to make a difference by selling Arab traditional clothes over the internet.
In the media, it seems there is a lot of negative Arab stereotyping, especially in the media, which always tries to portray us as barbarians, and it does not highlight the beautiful side of our culture. Arab Americans came out today to celebrate their culture and religion.
There has been a big demand for Arabic learning books. There has also been an increase in demand for translated Arabic books because many Americans want to study and understand the culture of the Middle East.
In the U.S., the new generation of Arab children, many of whom were not born before the September 11 attacks, is now learning their Arabic culture and heritage. They are also growing in an Arab American society where they are learning who they are and who they will be when they grow up. The new generation of Arab youth has really started to group and unite.
The goal is to ensure the emergence of an Arab community with a great deal of credibility, which will be respected and taken seriously by the American public.
Most of the people we have met today are Arab Americans from New York City. They all have lived minute to minute the painful events of the September 11th attacks. They told us today that the September 11 attacks have revived their inner sense of Arab nationalism, which had been buried inside of them. They came here today to say that they are here and they will not leave, and America must learn how to respect their Arabic way of living. Nasser Husseini, Al Jazeera, New York.
قال المتحدث باسم البيت الأبيض اليوم إن الرئيس الأمريكي
The White House spokesman said that U.S. President George Bush will make a speech to the American people on Monday to commemorate the September 11th attacks.
11 من سبتمبر 2001 في الولايات المتحدة.
5 years have passed since September 11, 2001, and Americans living in large cities are still worried about the possibility of new attacks. However, this worry is not present amongst Americans who live in the suburbs or far away from the cities. This is what was revealed in a new study, which also states that residents of these areas are living a normal life and are not affected by the continued campaign of fear that is being carried out by the American government since the attacks.
9/11 lifted the veil on a threat
هجمات
9/11 lifted the veil on a threat that is far broader and more dangerous than we saw that morning. An enemy that was not satiated by the destruction inflicted that day and is determined to strike again. To answer this threat and protect our people, we need more than retaliation. We need more than a reaction to the last attack. We need to do everything in our power to stop the next attack.
ما في وسعنا لمنع وقوع الهجوم القادم.
لقد طرأت تغييرات كبيرة على نمط الحياة الأمريكية بسبب الهجمات فيما يحاول الناس والسلطات تحقيق توازن.
The September 11th attacks have forced Americans to change their way of life as they and the government are trying to find a balance between security demands and civil liberties. New laws were passed after the attacks which limit these cherished American liberties. The anti-terrorism law, known as the Patriot Act, gives the security agency and police wider authority in conducting search operations and monitoring and eavesdropping on citizens. Based on controversial constitutional grounds, the American President, George Bush, allowed for eavesdropping on phone conversations of American citizens suspected of having links to terrorism. The September 11th attacks also increased feelings of animosity and hostility towards immigrants in general. This was reflected in strong political opposition towards the presence of illegal immigrants inside the country. Despite these effects that were felt by Americans in general, a particular segment of citizens feel that they are being specifically targeted, among them Arabs and Muslims in the United States.
من بينها العرب والمسلمون في الولايات المتحدة.
Unfortunately, there's been a hardening of views towards.
لسوء الحظ حدث تصلب في وجهات النظر تجاه.
Unfortunately, there have been hardened views towards Muslims and Islam. Opinion polls indicate that about a quarter of Americans feel threatened by Islam. However, there is a very positive side. After the September 11th attacks, people tried to learn about the religion of Islam and Muslims. Also, American Muslims must integrate themselves as part of the larger American society.
كجزء من المجتمع الأمريكي.
Reach out to the larger society.
الدراسات التي جرت عن آثار هجمات سبتمبر على الأمريكيين.
The studies that were conducted about the impact of September 11th attacks on Americans reveal some political contradictions. For example, residents of the cities that were impacted by the attacks, like the city of New York, are the most opposed to Bush's policies. Another contradiction is that the American president's popularity, which increased with his anti-terrorism agenda, is now diminishing because of the same agenda. The extremely high costs of the war on terrorism have taken funds away from the allocated budget for education, health, and social services. These are not the only political contradictions. For instance, the national unity that was formed following the September 11 attacks is now going through a lot of divisions over a long list of national security issues, including the wisdom behind the war in Iraq and the level of security provided at American airports.
عاطف عبد الجواد، تلفزيون المملكة العربية السعودية، واشنطن.
American President George Bush said that the war on terrorism is not a military battle, but one between different ideas and visions. These statements were repeated by Bush in his speeches as the 5th anniversary of the September 11th attacks approached. But observers accuse the American president of using the anniversary for political gain and to maintain the majority that the Republican Party enjoys in Congress during the upcoming November elections.
The strategy of the war on terrorism, its rules, its justifications, and its accomplishments were the topics carefully chosen by President George W. Bush and his administration to discuss in the latest series of speeches in anticipation of the 5th anniversary of the September 11th attacks.
The war on terror is more than a military conflict. It is the decisive ideological struggle of the 21st century. We are still in its early stages. To win this struggle, we have to defeat the ideology of the terrorists with a more hopeful vision.
Towing the American security line and repeating stock expressions about emergency laws, taking the war abroad to defend the country inside, the insistence on linking the war in Iraq to fighting terrorism, and making sure that Iran, does not possess nuclear weapons were all discussed by Bush in his latest speeches. Some believe the president is capitalizing on these topics to save his diminishing popularity and the Republican Party from an anticipated defeat in the next congressional elections.
Bush is trying to get support for his policies, which were criticized not only by the Democrats, but also by the Republicans, who are afraid that they will lose the elections because of his policies.
President Bush surprised the public by his admission of keeping secret detention centers abroad run by the CIA and the bill he submitted to Congress, which would allow trying those accused of terrorism in military courts despite the Supreme Court's rejection. He is also asking Congress to pass legislation to allow tapping of phone lines of terrorist suspects, a move that has been criticized and caused his administration embarrassment. Bush's latest speeches, in the opinions of some, are a desperate attempt to hide major failures.
He wants to bypass his legal failures, including the Michigan court ruling on phone tapping, by turning to Congress and pushing a new bill.
But it appears that the Democrats, who are looking to become a majority in Congress, have figured out his tactics.
For the president to say to Congress, you must support my bill or support terrorism, is completely unacceptable.
Among the messages carried in Bush's latest speeches, his remarks about Sunni Shiite terrorism and Islamic fascism in particular point to an important direction in the American president's strategy.
He wants to widen the definition of the big clash. So now he's trying to rally support in his constituency, represented by the extremist right-wing Christian groups in the United States who claim that Islam is the problem.
There is agreement that the president's speeches during the 5th anniversary of the September 11 attacks are speeches for an election campaign. If Bush won his bet in 2002 and 2004 using security and defending the American people against terrorism as his trump card, his wager on the same card this time may not guarantee victory for his party in the 2006 battle. At least, this is what the polls show.
With members of the IAEA Board of Governors meeting today in Vienna ahead of the UN nuclear watchdog, Mohammad El-Baradei hailed the progress Iran-EU nuclear talks are witnessing these days. El-Baradei is expected to officially release his report on Iran's nuclear activities to the 35-member governing board a few hours from now.
I still believe the negotiation is the best option to find a durable solution. I have been in contact with Mr. Dajani and with Mr. Solana yesterday, and I know both of them are making every effort to try to find areas of agreement. I hope when they meet next week that we will be able to see agreement to go back to the negotiating table.
Meanwhile, Iran's ambassador to the IAEA, Ali Ashar Soltani, said no resolution will be adopted in today's meeting and that member states are just to discuss Iran's nuclear program. Today's session of the IAEA's Board of Governors is to set the stage for the annual meeting of the agency's General Assembly, slated for the next week. And the non-aligned movement of developing nations began a summit in Cuba on Monday, criticizing mounting pressure by the United States and its allies on Iran to abandon its nuclear energy program. The summit speeches made no reference to the 5th anniversary of the September 11 attacks as a sign of animosity to the United States. The 6-day summit is expected to denounce the Bush administration for assuming the role of global policeman in its war on terrorism since the 9/11 attacks on the United States. Chairman of the International Center for Dialogue Among Civilizations, Mohammad Khatami, says a ban should be placed on efforts to incite violence in the name of religion and mobilize military forces on 4 corners of the world. under the guise of human rights and democracy. In a speech delivered at the U.S. University of Harvard, Khatami said the world needs to negate double standards. He further said one can't excuse a full-scale brutal war against innocent people by a government, citing the government is an internationally recognized institution, but rule out violence practiced by people as inhuman and barbaric. The former Iranian president said all well-wishers of the West and the Islamic world should redouble their efforts to force into the sidelines the arrogant warmongers and bar them from manipulating the public opinion as a propaganda stunt. Later, talking to reporters at the U.S. University of Harvard, Mr. Khatami expressed fellow feeling to American people who are remembering the victims of 9/11 attacks 5 years on since the Twin Towers from the World Trade Center came crashing down in 2001.
I was one of the first world leaders to condemn these barbaric and savage acts. As a human, as a Muslim, and as an Iranian, I stand before you to once again express my deepest sympathy with the families of the victims and with all the great American people. Let us wish for a world devoid of violence and anger, and instead blessed with compassion and peace.
Khatami also said Hezbollah is a symbol of Arab resistance, and those who oppose oppression and injustice are a far cry from terrorists. He said those who try to guard the country's territorial integrity don't fall under the same heading with war-like activists.
Iran's nuclear program is recently being discussed from a technical point of view. For example, there are news reports claiming that Morocco wants to build nuclear reactors, but the world does not seem to care. This means that the international community does not trust the Iranian regime. Who is responsible for this?
يعني إذا نرجع قليل إلى التاريخ من طرح مسألة الاستثمارات في الطاقة النووية في إيران يرجع إلى زمن الشاه.
Let us go a little back in history. Who did originally propose that Iran should invest in nuclear technology? The United States was the country that proposed that Iran invest in nuclear technology during the Shah's regime, in coordination with France, Germany, and Britain. What made these countries reverse their position? The answer is clear: the Iranian Islamic Revolution, because it came with Islamic principles, not Western or Eastern values.
تعهدات بالنسبة لإكمال محطة بوشهر النووية. ألمانيا سنة قبل الثورة تراجعت عن الموضوع. يعني قرار دولي، قرار يحكم فيها قبل الثورة. يعني لأنه
This means that Iran could not depend on the West or the East. Germany had made commitments to complete the Iranian Bushehr nuclear facility, but after the Islamic Revolution, it changed its position. Before the Islamic Revolution, there were agreements between Iran and France in which Tehran acquired 10% of the shares of a French Ordi company for uranium enrichment. According to the agreement, 10% of the enriched uranium was supposed to be shipped to Iran annually. These shipments, however, were halted since the Islamic Revolution. Western countries reneged on the legal agreements that they made with Iran before the Islamic Revolution. There are talks that Iran should not enrich uranium on its land and that a third country should enrich it on its behalf. Western countries, who were Iran's partners in enriching uranium, changed their mind after the Islamic Revolution and banned the transportation of nuclear-related materials to Iran. The International Atomic Energy Agency prevented Iran from reaping the benefits of nuclear technology. They are blaming Iran for hiding its nuclear program for the past 18 years. But why did Iran do this? The United States and Western countries declared a boycott against Iran, and the boycott still exists. They are talking about imposing sanctions against Iran, but the sanctions practically exist. Industrial countries thoroughly investigate everything before shipping it to Iran to find whether it can be used for nuclear purposes or not. This has been in place for a long time. Nevertheless, Iran has acquired nuclear technology that it developed internally. This surprised the West because the Westerners thought that Iran will always depend on them to get its enriched uranium. But now they are facing the outcome. Iran is a nuclear country and no one can change this. The fact that Iran has nuclear technology leaves them with only two alternatives, either confrontation or negotiation.
والآن هم في مواجهة بأن إيران أصبحت دولة نووية، وهذا ما لا مراجعة فيها لأن عندها القدرة العلمية لهذه المسألة. والآن يبقى الخيار، أما المواجهة أما المفاوضة.
Al-Qaeda releases video of 9/11 terrorists. Taliban strikes in Kabul, killing 20. Corpses pile up in Baghdad morgue. Link TV brings you these stories and more on this Mosaic Intelligence Report.
Five years after the September 11, 2001 Al-Qaeda terrorist attacks on the United States, President George W. Bush says much has been accomplished and that the U.S., its friends, and allies are taking